What if the financial systems we trust every day are not collapsing by accident, but following a predictable pattern that has repeated for centuries? This question is uncomfortable, because it forces us to confront a possibility that most people prefer to avoid. What if the fraud is not the exception, but the structure itself? When you look closely at Greece, Russia, Argentina, and so many other nations that have fallen into the same cycle, the coincidences disappear. What remains is a sequence, a method, a 7-stage pattern that always begins quietly, grows in the shadows, and only becomes visible when it is already too late for the average citizen to escape its consequences. This is the moment when people begin to feel that something is wrong, but they cannot explain why. Prices rise, wages stagnate, governments promise what they cannot deliver. Central banks inject money as if printing were a cure, and the media insists everything is normal. But history teaches a harsher truth. Fraud never starts with chaos. It begins with comfort. It begins when nations believe they are too powerful to fail. It begins when societies accept illusions, because illusions feel safer than reality. The same signals that once appeared in Greece before its financial unraveling, or in Russia before its manipulative monetary restructuring, or in Argentina before every major collapse, are visible again now. And this time, they are appearing in the West. The nations that once pointed fingers at others are now standing at stage 5 of the same pattern they warned the world about. But before we explore these stages one by one, we need to understand something deeper. Patterns do not lie, even when governments do. When you recognize the script, you suddenly see what is coming long before it becomes obvious. This is why understanding the hidden structure behind financial fraud is not just knowledge, it is protection. It is clarity in a world built on distraction. You have probably felt this tension yourself at some point. Maybe through rising costs, shrinking opportunities, or the strange sense that things look stable on the surface, but feel unstable underneath. Have you ever experienced that? If this resonates with you, leave a comment sharing your perspective. Your experience may help someone else identify the same signs. And while you are here, check if you are already subscribed to the channel and leave a like. It helps this investigation reach more people who need to see it. What comes next might challenge a lot of assumptions, but it will make the entire picture clearer, step by step, as we move deeper into the 7-stage pattern that history keeps repeating. When you start examining the long arc of financial history, one truth emerges with uncomfortable clarity. Fraud does not appear suddenly. It grows slowly, anchored in structural weaknesses that societies choose to ignore. Every major collapse begins with the same silent shift, when governments expand spending beyond sustainable levels and central banks step in to mask the imbalance. This early stage feels harmless, even beneficial, because people enjoy temporary prosperity, easy credit, and the illusion of stability. But beneath that surface, the seed of future crisis is already planted, nourished by denial and political convenience. The more a nation relies on monetary expansion instead of real productivity, the faster it moves toward the next stage of the pattern. As expectations rise, so does vulnerability. Nations begin assuming that economic growth will continue indefinitely, a belief that leads to exaggerated promises and unrealistic commitments. During this phase, institutions appear strong from the outside, but internally they become increasingly fragile. Historical records are full of empires and republics that fell into the same trap, mistaking short-term financial engineering for genuine progress. Whether in Greece building its pre-crisis prosperity on borrowed money, or Russia using monetary interventions to hold its currency together, or Argentina repeatedly cycling through inflation and restructuring, the early warning signs are identical. Excessive confidence becomes the fuel that accelerates the decline. The psychological aspect is crucial here, because collective optimism blinds people to the risks they should be seeing. Individuals assume that if everyone else believes in the system, then the system must be safe. Investors chase returns, households take on debt, and politicians insist that growth will compensate for every imbalance. It is precisely this shared illusion that allows fraud to scale without resistance. The structure becomes more fragile, but the narrative becomes stronger, leading entire societies into a manufactured sense of comfort. Once this dynamic is in place, the transition to the next stage of the pattern becomes inevitable. And while each country expresses this cycle in its own way, the underlying mechanisms are always the same: inflated promises, distorted incentives, and an economic environment that quietly shifts from productive to extractive. By the time the surface starts showing cracks, the internal damage is already extensive. That is why understanding these early phases is essential. They reveal how nations begin sliding toward the same repeating outcome, long before the collapse becomes visible. As the pattern unfolds further, Greece becomes one of the clearest modern examples of how a nation can be guided, step by step, into financial vulnerability without the public fully realizing what is happening. Before the crisis became global news, the country had already entered the deeper stages of the cycle. Years of borrowing had created an economy supported more by external credit than internal strength, and yet the illusion of growth remained intact. This illusion did not exist by accident. It was reinforced by institutions, international partners, and internal political narratives that insisted everything was under control. Even as debt spiraled upward, the appearance of normality was preserved at all costs. The critical element in the Greek case was how systematically information was softened, disguised, or postponed. Statistical manipulations, restructured accounting methods, and negotiated presentations of national debt allowed the country to appear healthier than it truly was. These practices were not isolated errors. They were part of a larger framework in which maintaining investor confidence mattered more than addressing the underlying fragility. When a nation reaches this stage, the truth becomes a threat to stability, so the truth is pushed aside. What matters is the story being told, not the numbers beneath it. And while Greece is often portrayed as an exception, in reality it represents a blueprint. Many countries follow similar trajectories but only become headlines once the collapse is impossible to hide. By the time the Greek people began experiencing the consequences, the system had already passed multiple points of no return. Banks were exposed, public institutions were stretched, and households were carrying debt levels that could no longer be supported by the real economy. The transition from optimism to crisis seemed abrupt, but it was the result of years of structural erosion disguised by temporary fixes and financial engineering. The most revealing part is how quickly confidence evaporates once the illusion breaks. Investors who once supported the system withdraw. Governments impose emergency measures. Citizens face sudden restrictions that feel shocking only because the warning signs were ignored for so long. The Greek experience demonstrates what happens when a country enters the mid-stages of the pattern. The narrative of prosperity collapses, replaced by an urgent scramble to contain the fallout. And although each nation believes it will manage these pressures uniquely, history shows that the underlying dynamics repeat with remarkable consistency. If Greece revealed the cracks that appear when a country hides its weaknesses, Russia exposes a different layer of the pattern: the strategic manipulation of money itself. Unlike nations that passively slide into crisis, Russia has historically used monetary engineering as an active tool of power, control, and survival. Long before its more visible geopolitical actions, the country was already navigating internal instability through currency reforms, bank restructurings, and calculated interventions designed to maintain the appearance of order. These moves often seem abrupt from the outside, but within the broader historical pattern, they are the predictable reactions of a system entering a more advanced stage of financial tension. One of the most revealing aspects of Russia's economic behavior is how the state treats money not as a neutral instrument, but as a weapon. Currency controls, interest rate shocks, liquidity freezes, and sudden policy reversals are all part of a strategy that allows the system to absorb pressure without openly admitting the depth of the underlying fragility. When a nation reaches this point, transparency becomes dangerous. The priority shifts from growth to containment, and containment requires controlling not just the economy, but the perception of the economy. This is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. Financial engineering replaces real productivity, and narratives replace stability. Historically, Russia has cycled through abrupt transitions that align with this deeper structure. Whether during the late Soviet era, the chaotic 1990s, or the more recent monetary maneuvers that followed external sanctions and internal shocks, the underlying logic remains the same. When confidence erodes, the state intervenes more aggressively. When the currency destabilizes, capital restrictions tighten. When the system approaches breaking points, the government shifts from managing the economy to managing expectations. At this stage, the average citizen begins to feel the weight of decisions they never voted for and rarely understand. This is the moment where societies enter a psychological fog. People sense instability, but struggle to identify the source. Prices fluctuate unpredictably. Savings lose value without warning. Policies change so rapidly that long-term planning becomes impossible. The public narrative insists that everything is under control. Yet daily, experience tells a different story. And just like in Greece, the illusion lasts only as long as people believe in it. Once confidence breaks, the truth becomes visible all at once, not because it appeared suddenly, but because it could no longer be hidden. Russia illustrates how manipulation becomes a survival mechanism, a last attempt to hold the system together as it moves deeper into the pattern. Understanding these signals is essential, because they reveal more about the future of today's major economies than many people realize. If this perspective resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me which part of this pattern you recognize the most. Argentina represents one of the most striking examples of a nation trapped in a repeating financial cycle, where each crisis seems to reset the system without ever truly repairing it. Unlike Greece, which faced a sudden unraveling, or Russia, which relies heavily on strategic monetary engineering, Argentina lives inside a loop. Inflation, devaluation, debt restructuring, temporary recoveries, political transitions, and renewed collapse all follow one another with such regularity that the pattern becomes almost predictable. What makes the Argentine case so revealing is not just the severity of its crises, but the persistence of the same underlying mechanisms across multiple generations. Looking deeper, you see that Argentina's crises are not isolated failures. They emerge from structural incentives within the political and economic system. Governments often resort to printing money to finance spending, especially when public expectations demand benefits the real economy cannot support. At first, this expansion feels like relief. Consumption rises, optimism returns, and political approval grows. But as the money supply outpaces real productivity, inflation accelerates. The public reacts by adjusting prices, wages, and contracts upward, reinforcing the inflationary spiral. This feedback loop becomes so entrenched that even small policy mistakes can trigger massive consequences. International borrowing amplifies the cycle. When inflation becomes unmanageable, governments seek external loans to stabilize the economy. These loans temporarily strengthen the currency and create an impression of renewed stability. But the underlying issues remain unchanged. Productivity does not increase, fiscal management does not improve, and the political system continues rewarding short-term solutions. Eventually, the debt becomes unsustainable, leading to restructuring, capital controls, and another wave of public frustration. The collapse appears sudden, but it is simply the continuation of a long-standing pattern. What truly distinguishes Argentina is how deeply these cycles affect the collective mindset. People grow accustomed to instability. Savings habits change, investments shift toward assets that can survive inflation or devaluation. Families begin to measure time not by political administrations, but by financial crises. This psychological adaptation reveals a crucial point about the seven-stage pattern. Once a society has been through enough cycles, it becomes desensitized to early warning signs. What would be alarming in other countries becomes normal in Argentina. These systemic and psychological layers offer an essential lesson for understanding Stage 5, because Argentina shows what happens when a nation repeatedly moves through the same phases without correcting the structural causes. It becomes a living record of how financial erosion shapes institutions, behaviors, and long-term expectations. And although many countries believe they are immune to such dynamics, the Argentine experience shows that once a system embraces debt dependence, monetary manipulation, and political short-termism, the cycle becomes increasingly difficult to escape. As you move from individual national crises into the broader global framework, the seven-stage pattern becomes clearer than ever. The moment a system enters stage 5, the tone of the entire economy changes. It is no longer a matter of isolated mistakes or temporary imbalances. It becomes a structural condition. This stage is defined by an economy that still functions, but only because it is constantly supported by artificial mechanisms. At first, these mechanisms resemble stabilization tools. Over time, they evolve into life support. What once looked like normal policy becomes a permanent intervention required to prevent the entire system from collapsing under its own weight. In this phase, debt transforms from a financial instrument into a survival strategy. Governments rely on continuous borrowing to meet obligations that the real economy can no longer sustain. Central banks expand balance sheets, purchase assets, suppress interest rates, and introduce new liquidity programs designed to delay the consequences of earlier excesses. These actions are justified as necessary, even responsible, but historically they signal a deeper issue. The productive foundation of the system is no longer strong enough to carry the weight of its promises. The engine keeps running, but only because fuel is being injected faster than it can burn. Public perception becomes a crucial element here. Societies entering stage 5 often feel a strange duality. On one hand, life appears stable enough. Stores are open, services function, and markets continue operating. On the other hand, people sense that something fundamental has changed. Prices rise faster than incomes. Savings lose value more quickly. The economy feels heavier, slower, more fragile. Yet because the surface has not fully cracked, most individuals assume that the system is merely adjusting. This collective misunderstanding is one of the reasons stage 5 lasts longer than many expect. The decline is happening, but it is happening behind policy decisions, financial engineering, and institutional confidence. When you compare this stage with historical precedents such as Greece, Russia, or Argentina, the parallels are unmistakable. Each of these nations reached a point where their systems could not sustain past commitments without relying on increasingly aggressive, temporary measures. And now, the same mechanisms are visible across the Western world. The difference is that this time, the scale is larger, the institutions involved are more influential, and the belief in immunity is stronger. Stage 5 is the threshold, where a system still appears functional, but only because it has shifted from organic stability to engineered survival. It is the moment when history quietly warns that the next phases will not be reversible through simple adjustments, because the underlying structure has already been stretched beyond its natural limits. As stage 5 matures, the system enters a phase where internal pressure rises faster than policymakers can contain it. This tension does not explode immediately. It accumulates. The signs appear in subtle distortions that most people notice but cannot fully interpret. Currencies begin reacting unpredictably to policy announcements. Market rallies feel forced, disconnected from real economic performance. Governments expand programs that once were temporary, transforming emergency tools into permanent pillars of the financial architecture. What appears as stability is, in reality, controlled instability. The system functions not because it is healthy, but because it is managed daily to prevent visible collapse. One of the strongest signals that a system is approaching the next stage of the pattern is the growing gap between official narratives and lived reality. Institutions continue publishing optimistic projections. Politicians insist the fundamentals remain strong, but households feel something different. They experience shrinking purchasing power, rising costs of essential goods, and an erosion of savings that cannot be explained by temporary disruptions. When this disconnect becomes persistent, trust begins to fracture. And once trust fractures, the system's ability to mask deeper structural weaknesses weakens dramatically. Another defining feature of this moment is the behavior of financial elites. Historically, during late stage 5, the most informed actors begin reallocating assets, diversifying internationally, and preparing for volatility, long before the general public understands what is happening. This has been documented repeatedly, whether in crises involving places like Argentina, during monetary disruptions in Russia, or amid sovereign tensions seen in Greece. The pattern is identical. Those closest to the system act first. Those dependent on official assurances act last. At this stage, the government's role shifts from stabilizing the economy to managing perception. New regulations surface. Liquidity programs expand without clear expiration dates. Central banks begin making decisions that were once considered unthinkable, because maintaining the illusion of control becomes more important than addressing long-term damage. This is the point where the foundations are no longer deteriorating slowly. They are eroding openly. And the most concerning part is that societies often adapt to this erosion without realizing its significance. People normalize volatility, justify rising costs, and accept policies that would once have been met with resistance. Understanding this psychological adaptation is essential, because it reveals why Stage 6 often arrives quietly. When populations internalize the idea that instability is normal, the final phases of the pattern can advance without public reaction. And by the time the consequences become undeniable, the system is already operating in survival mode, preparing for the structural break that history has shown repeatedly. If you recognize any of these signals in your own experience, leave a comment sharing which part stands out the most in today's economic climate. As financial pressure deepens and the system prepares to cross the boundary into Stage 6, an equally important transformation begins. Not in institutions, but in the mindset of the population. Historical records show that before every major financial rupture, societies go through a psychological shift marked by contradiction. People feel uncertainty growing, yet they seek comfort in familiar explanations. They sense imbalance, yet they prefer to believe in stability. This cognitive tension becomes a defining element of the late stages of the pattern, because it shapes how the public reacts to the escalating distortions around them. Daily life becomes filled with inconsistencies. Prices rise in ways that do not align with official inflation numbers. Job markets appear strong on paper, yet individuals feel more financially strained than ever. Credit becomes both more accessible and more dangerous, as families rely on borrowing not to advance, but to maintain a standard of living that real wages can no longer support. These contradictions slowly erode a society's ability to interpret economic reality. When signals conflict, people retreat into hope, routine, and distraction. This is not a flaw of character. It is a predictable response to chronic uncertainty. Another psychological marker of this stage is the normalization of dysfunction. When small instabilities become frequent, the population adapts. They learn to navigate shortages, price swings, policy changes, and financial unpredictability as if these conditions were part of ordinary life. This adaptation may appear like resilience, but historically it is one of the clearest indicators of pre-collapse behavior. When instability becomes familiar, societies stop questioning its cause. And when they stop questioning, institutions feel less pressure to correct the underlying damage. The pattern accelerates because the public no longer resists it. This is also the point where narratives become more powerful than data. Governments emphasize recovery, journalists highlight isolated improvements, and public conversations shift toward optimism, even when lived experience contradicts it. People want to believe that conditions will improve, so they embrace any positive signal as confirmation. This optimism is not genuine confidence. It is emotional self-defense. The mind gravitates toward reassurance when the environment feels unpredictable. But this emotional coping mechanism blinds societies to the approaching rupture, making the transition into Stage 6 feel sudden, even though the warning signs were present for years. The final psychological layer of this stage is fatigue. After long periods of instability, societies become tired of analyzing, questioning, and worrying. They disengage. They avoid discussions about the economy. They focus only on immediate needs. This withdrawal is historically consistent across many nations and often precedes the decisive shift into the final stages of the pattern. When societies stop paying attention, the system crosses thresholds that would once have provoked alarm, quietly, and without resistance. Understanding these psychological dynamics is crucial, because they reveal why Stage 6 does not arrive with panic. It arrives with exhaustion, normalization, and a collective desire to believe that everything will correct itself. even when history shows that the most critical changes occur precisely when the population stops looking. As the system edges closer to stage 6, the most striking phenomenon is how unprepared societies remain, even after years of warning signs. This lack of preparation is not simply the result of misinformation or poor policy communication. It is a structural feature of collapsing financial cycles. Stage 6 arrives at the exact moment when institutions have exhausted their tools, households have exhausted their resilience, and markets have exhausted their illusions. Yet most people continue, believing that a return to normal is imminent. This belief is not naive. It is a psychological necessity when the alternative feels too overwhelming to confront. One of the main reasons societies fail to anticipate stage 6 is that the transition does not resemble the dramatic collapses portrayed in history books. There are no immediate defaults, no instant currency failures, no sudden institutional breakdowns. Instead, the shift manifests through a steady loss of control. Policies that once stabilized the economy begin producing diminishing results. Emergency interventions generate side effects that require new interventions. Markets behave unpredictably, responding not to fundamentals, but to signals of weakness, hesitation, or desperation. By the time these patterns become obvious, structural damage has already progressed beyond easy repair. Another factor is institutional overconfidence. Governments and financial authorities insist that they possess the tools to handle any disruption, reinforcing the idea that crises can be managed indefinitely. This belief delays recognition of deeper vulnerabilities. In previous eras, societies entered stage 6 with less complexity, fewer global linkages, and more localized economic structures. Today, financial systems are interconnected to a degree unprecedented in history. This means the consequences of one nation's fragility are rapidly transmitted across borders. Yet the public continues expecting isolated solutions, not realizing that stage 6 is defined by systemic, not national stress. The private sector also unintentionally contributes to the illusion. Corporations continue operating, adapting, and repositioning, maintaining the appearance of functionality even as internal costs escalate and planning horizons shrink. Consumers continue spending, often through credit, masking declines in real purchasing power. Investors search for safe assets, driving markets in directions that obscure broader instability. All these actions create the illusion of continuity, even though foundational conditions are deteriorating beneath the surface. Stage 6 thrives in this environment of partial normality, where the signals are too complex for the average citizen to interpret clearly. The most profound reason societies remain unprepared, however, lies in the emotional dimension of financial decline. People avoid acknowledging the magnitude of systemic risk because doing so requires confronting uncertainty about the future. As long as daily routines remain intact, they assume the system is sturdier than it truly is. This disconnect between perception and reality allows stage 6 to advance quietly, step by step, until the moment when internal pressures finally exceed the ability of institutions to contain them. And by the time that moment arrives, the transition into the final stage of the pattern is already underway, shaping consequences that will redefine the economic landscape for years to come. When a system finally reaches stage 7, the transformation that unfolds is not a singular event, but a structural shift that reshapes the financial order from the inside out. Stage 7 is the point where accumulated pressures no longer respond to traditional interventions. The mechanisms that once stabilized the economy become ineffective, and new fractures emerge faster than institutions can contain them. This stage is not defined by panic alone. It is defined by the irreversible breaking of assumptions that held the system together. Governments discover that even aggressive policies no longer produce the intended results. Markets reveal vulnerabilities that were previously hidden, and the public realizes, often abruptly, that the environment they relied on has changed permanently. A defining aspect of stage 7 is the disappearance of the familiar markers of stability. Interest rates no longer guide economic behavior. Monetary injections fail to restore confidence. Investors react to signals, with exaggerated volatility, amplifying every shift in sentiment. Structural weaknesses that were once invisible become impossible to ignore. Fiscal pressures escalate to levels that force governments to choose between politically costly measures and long-term economic deterioration. In this environment, small shocks generate disproportionate consequences because the system no longer has the elasticity to absorb them. The framework that once supported growth now works against itself. Social dynamics evolve as well. Families and businesses begin recalibrating priorities, abandoning long-term planning and focusing on immediate survival. They shift from optimism to caution, from expansion to preservation. This behavioral transition accelerates the breakdown of the old financial order because consumption, investment, and risk-taking fall simultaneously. At the institutional level, late-stage reforms emerge, but they carry the weight of being reactive rather than preventative. Policymakers attempt to rebuild public trust, yet the credibility lost during earlier stages becomes difficult to recover. What remains is a landscape shaped by uncertainty, fragmentation, and the gradual emergence of a new economic model that has not yet taken form. In the broader global context, Stage 7 serves as a reset point. The systems that once appeared untouchable undergo profound revision. Alliances shift. Monetary frameworks evolve. Nations that anticipated the transition adapt more quickly, while those in denial face prolonged instability. And just like earlier historical cycles, the end of one financial era quietly marks the beginning of another, shaped by lessons learned too late and opportunities recognized only after the fact. The pattern does not end. It simply transforms, preparing the ground for a new configuration of power, influence, and economic reality. If you stayed with me until this point, leave a comment saying something like "This message was for me," or "I am here until the end," so I know you followed the full journey through the 7-stage pattern. And if the value of this analysis made the complex world of financial history and economic cycles clearer for you, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. A like also helps this kind of deeper investigation reach more people who want to understand what is really happening beneath the surface. There is another video right here that expands on these ideas and connects directly with what we explored today, so click and continue with me on the next chapter of this conversation.